The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the same day Cecilia Osmond's dreams drowned in the muddy waters of the Missouri River, along with nearly everything else she owned in this world. She stood on the riverbank, skirts sodden, her red gold hair plastered to her scalp, watching the remnants of her trunk disappear beneath the churning brown surface. The year was 1878, and Cecilia had traveled from Boston to meet the man who had promised to make her his wife. The man whose letter of promise now dissolved into pulp somewhere in that treacherous waterway. "Miss, are you injured?" A deep voice cut through her daze of despair. Cecilia turned to find a tall man astride a dappled gray horse. His face was partly shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he was studying her with concern. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, he wore the practical attire of a working cattleman: dusty denims, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. "I'm not hurt," she managed, her voice barely audible over the rush of the river. "Just, everything I own is gone." He dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. "The ferry accident?" he asked, approaching slowly as if afraid she might spook like a wild creature. Cecilia nodded, glancing back at the river where the overloaded ferry had capsized less than an hour ago. Most passengers had made it to shore, but their belongings hadn't been so fortunate, including my letter, she said, more to herself than to him. "Your letter." He stood beside her now, tall enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his gaze. "My letter of promise. From Mr. Howard Blackburn of Sierra Vista, Arizona Territory." Saying it aloud made her situation suddenly, terribly real. "I'm a mail-order bride, you see, or I was supposed to be." The man was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and eyes as blue as a summer sky. "My name is Frank Evans," he said, extending a calloused hand. "And Sierra Vista happens to be my destination as well." Cecilia hesitated before placing her much smaller hand in his. "Cecilia Osmond, Miss Osmond," he said, releasing her hand and replacing his hat. "I believe we can solve this problem. I'll write you a better letter than the one you lost." She blinked, uncertain she'd heard him correctly. "I don't understand." "I mean, I'll help you get to Sierra Vista, and when we arrive, if this Howard Blackburn doesn't recognize you without your letter, I'll vouch for you." His lips curved in a brief smile. "But first, we need to get you dried off and find you some provisions for the journey." Cecilia stared at the stranger, wondering if she could trust him. But what choice did she have? Stranded in a frontier town with no possessions, no money, and no proof of her arrangement with Howard Blackburn, her prospects were grim indeed. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Frank Evans studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "Because 18 months ago my sister found herself in a similar situation. Only difference was, no one stopped to help her." Something in his voice, a barely contained anger beneath the calm exterior, told Cecilia there was much more to that story. But she didn't press. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and nodded. "I accept your offer, Mr. Evans. Thank you." He gestured toward the town. "The general store should still be open. We'll get you what you need, then make camp outside town. We can join a wagon train headed for the Arizona Territory tomorrow morning." As they walked toward his horse, Cecilia suddenly stopped. "Mr. Evans, I should tell you that I have very little money. Most of what I had was in my trunk." Frank paused, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a bank draft for the sale of my cattle herd. I've got enough to outfit you properly and still have plenty left for my land purchase in Sierra Vista." "I couldn't possibly. You can repay me when you're settled with your Mr. Blackburn," he said, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. "Now come on. Storm's brewing and we need to get supplies before it hits." Cecilia followed him, grateful yet wary of this unexpected kindness. In Boston, she'd learned that men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. But as Frank Evans helped her mount his horse before swinging up behind her, keeping a respectful distance between their bodies, She allowed herself to hope that perhaps Western men were different. The general store in the small Missouri town was still open when they arrived, though the proprietor looked eager to close up before the approaching storm. While Frank negotiated for supplies, Cecilia selected the most practical and affordable items she could find: 2 simple calico dresses, undergarments, a shawl, and a sturdy pair of boots. "Add a good hat and coat," Frank called from the counter where he was purchasing food supplies. Arizona sun's fierce, but the nights get cold, especially this time of year. By the time they left the store, the first fat raindrops were falling. Frank led her to a small boarding house where he paid for a room for her while he saw to camping arrangements for himself. "We leave at first light," he said, tipping his hat. "I'll come fetch you." That night, as Cecilia lay in the narrow bed listening to rain hammer the roof, she thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a companion to elderly Mrs. Whitfield in Boston, with little prospect of marriage or a family of her own. At 26, she was considered firmly on the shelf, too bookish and opinionated for Boston's eligible bachelors, when Mrs. Whitfield died, leaving Cecilia unemployed. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like divine providence. "Successful rancher seeks educated, respectable woman for marriage, must be willing to relocate to Arizona territory." Her correspondence with Howard Blackburn had been brief, but promising. He described himself as 40 years old, established, with a prosperous cattle ranch near Sierra Vista. He'd seemed impressed by her education and her ability to manage a household. The letter of promise had arrived 3 weeks later along with train fare. Now that letter was gone, and Cecilia was placing her trust in a stranger. As she drifted toward sleep, she wondered about Frank Evans. He'd said little about himself during their brief acquaintance, but there was something in his manner, a quiet competence, an innate decency that reassured her. Morning came with clearing skies and a renewed sense of purpose. Cecilia dressed in one of her new calico dresses, arranged her damp hair as best she could, and packed her few possessions in the canvas bag Frank had purchased for her. He was waiting downstairs, hat in hand, looking fresher than a man who'd likely slept outdoors had any right to. "Good morning, Miss Osmond. Ready to head west." The wagon train consisted of 12 wagons, mostly families heading to new homesteads in the territories. Frank introduced Cecilia to the wagon master, a grizzled man named Jasper Stone, explaining her situation in low tones that she couldn't quite hear. "Well, madam," Stone said, tugging his beard, "we've got room. Always good to have another pair of hands, especially educated ones. Got 3 young'uns need schooling if you're willing." "I'd be happy to help," Cecilia said. Frank had purchased a mule for her to ride, a docile creature named Bessie. "Steadier than a horse for someone who's not used to riding long distances," he explained. As they joined the line of wagons pulling out of town, Cecilia found herself alongside a covered wagon driven by a woman not much older than herself. The woman had a baby strapped to her chest and a toddler sitting beside her. "I'm Martha Wilson," she introduced herself. "This is James Jr. and the baby is Eliza. My husband's riding ahead with the scouts." "Cecilia Osmond," she replied, warmed by the friendly greeting. "I'm heading to Sierra Vista to be married." Martha's face lit up. "A bride, how exciting! Is that your intended?" She nodded toward Frank, who was riding several yards ahead, conversing with another horseman. "Oh no," Cecilia felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Evans is just escorting me. My fiancé is waiting in Sierra Vista." "Well, if I may say so, your escort is certainly easy on the eyes," Martha said with a wink. "If things don't work out with your Arizona gentleman, you might consider alternatives closer at hand." Cecilia laughed, but found her gaze drifting to Frank's broad shoulders and straight back. She quickly redirected her thoughts. "How long have you been traveling?" she asked, changing the subject. The first days of the journey passed without incident. Frank often rode ahead with the scouts but made a point of checking on Cecilia regularly. In the evenings, as promised, she helped teach the children, using sticks to write letters in the dirt and teaching simple arithmetic using pebbles and twigs. To her surprise, Frank sometimes joined these impromptu lessons, sitting quietly at the edge of the circle. After the children were called away for supper one evening, he lingered. "You're a good teacher," he said. "Patient," Cecilia smiled. "I enjoy it. I taught at a girls' school in Boston before becoming Mrs. Whitfield's companion." "Your Mr. Blackburn is getting quite a bargain," Frank said, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "I hope he thinks so," Cecilia replied, "though I'm not sure what skills from Boston will transfer to ranch life in Arizona." "Intelligence and adaptability go far anywhere," Frank said. He hesitated, then added, "Would you care to walk with me? It's a fine evening." They strolled away from the circle of wagons, staying within sight of the campfires. The spring air was cool but pleasant, filled with the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. "Mr. Evans, Frank, please." "Frank," Cecilia amended, "you've told me almost nothing about yourself, yet you've gone to considerable trouble on my behalf." He was quiet for several steps. "Not much to tell. I was born in Pennsylvania, moved west with my parents when I was 12. They died of fever 2 years later. My sister Clara and I were taken in by our uncle in Kansas. I started working cattle drives at 16, saved every penny." He paused. "What about you?" "How does a Boston school teacher decide to become a mail-order bride?" Cecilia explained about Mrs. Whitfield's death, her lack of family or prospects. "It wasn't a decision I made lightly," she concluded, "but I've always longed for a family of my own, and at 26. 26 is hardly ancient," Frank said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "In Boston, it might as well be 90, she replied with a small laugh. They had reached the edge of a small stream that the wagons had camped near. In the moonlight, the water gleamed like silver. "And this Howard Blackburn," Frank said after a moment. "You're certain he's a good man?" The question took Cecilia aback. "We've exchanged letters for 3 months. He seems kind, established." She realized how little she actually knew about her future husband. "He mentioned that he's 40, a successful rancher, and that he's looking for a wife who can help manage the household and perhaps teach any children we might have." Frank nodded slowly. "Just be careful. The territories can be rough. Not all men are honorable. Are you?" The question slipped out before Cecilia could stop it. In the moonlight, Frank's smile was a flash of white. "I try to be, Miss Osmond, I try to be." On the 10th day of their journey, disaster struck. The wagon train was crossing a shallow section of the Red River when the current suddenly strengthened, likely from rain upstream. Martha Wilson's wagon, ahead of Cecilia, began to tilt precariously. Without hesitation, Frank spurred his horse into the water, reaching the wagon just as it started to tip. He grabbed the toddler, James Jr., from Martha's grasp and shouted for her to hold tight to the baby. Then the wagon overturned completely. Cecilia watched in horror as Frank, still clutching the child, was swept downstream. Several men plunged into the water after them, while others worked to rescue Martha and her baby. For 20 agonizing minutes, Cecilia stood on the bank, praying as she'd never prayed before. Finally, a shout went up from downstream. Frank had managed to grab onto an overhanging tree branch, keeping both himself and the child above water until help arrived. When they returned to the camp, Frank was pale and exhausted, his clothes soaked and torn. The Wilson family was safely reunited, the parents tearfully thanking Frank for saving their son. That night, as the camp settled, Cecilia found Frank sitting alone by a small fire, wrapped in a blanket someone had lent him. "You could have died today," she said softly, sitting beside him. He shrugged. "Couldn't just watch it happen." Cecilia studied his profile, seeing him with new eyes. "You're a good man, Frank Evans." He turned to look at her, and in his gaze she saw something that made her heart flutter strangely. "I'm just a man trying to do right, Cecilia Osmond." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and somehow it changed everything. The next morning, Frank was feverish. The wagon master insisted he ride in Martha Wilson's wagon to rest, an arrangement the Wilsons eagerly agreed to, grateful for his heroism. For the next 3 days, Cecilia divided her time between teaching the children and tending to Frank. His fever rose and fell, and during his more lucid moments, he told her stories of his years as a cowboy cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, encounters with native tribes, the changing landscape of the West as railroads pushed ever further into once remote territories. On the evening of the 3rd day, his fever broke. Cecilia found him sitting up in the wagon, looking weak but clear-eyed. "You've been taking care of me," he said. Cecilia handed him a cup of broth. "You took care of me first." As Frank recovered, the relationship between them subtly shifted. There was an ease, a familiarity that hadn't existed before. They spent evenings talking by the fire after the children's lessons, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Frank spoke of his dream to establish his own ranch, to build something lasting. "I've been saving for 10 years, he told her. "Land prices are good in the Arizona territory. I've got my eye on a plot near Sierra Vista, good water, good grazing." "It sounds wonderful," Cecilia said, trying to ignore the pang she felt at the thought of them going their separate ways once they reached their destination. "What about you?" Frank asked. "What are your dreams beyond marriage to Howard Blackburn?" The question gave her pause. "I suppose. A home, children, the chance to continue teaching in some capacity." She hesitated. "And books. I miss having books around me." Frank smiled. "I've got books, not many but good ones. Shakespeare, Twain, a few volumes of poetry, a cowboy who reads poetry," Cecilia teased. "Don't tell the other fellows," he said with a wink. "They'd never let me live it down." As the wagon train crossed into the New Mexico territory, the landscape changed dramatically. The lush greenery of the eastern territories gave way to stark, breathtaking vistas, mesas and buttes rising from the earth like ancient monuments. Skies so vast and blue they seemed almost unreal. One afternoon, as they rode side by side, Frank pointed to a distant mountain range. "That's where we're headed. Another week, maybe 10 days, and we'll be in Sierra Vista." Cecilia felt a conflicting surge of emotions, anticipation mixed with a strange reluctance. In the weeks since the river accident, Howard Blackburn had begun to seem less real, more a distant figure from a story she'd once read. The man beside her, however, the man whose laughter she'd come to cherish, whose quiet strength had repeatedly seen them through difficulties, whose blue eyes sometimes lingered on her in ways that made her breath catch, he was very real indeed. That night, unable to sleep, Cecilia sat by the dying embers of the communal fire. The stars overhead were brilliant, more numerous than she'd ever seen in Boston. "Can't sleep." Frank's voice was quiet as he settled beside her. "Just thinking," she replied, "about your Mr. Blackburn." She nodded, though in truth her thoughts had been more concerned with the man now sitting beside her. "I wonder if he'll still want me without the letter. What if he's already found someone else?" "Then he's a fool," Frank said simply. The words hung between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. "Frank," Cecilia began hesitantly, "what happened to your sister? You mentioned she was in a situation similar to mine." His expression darkened. "Clara answered an advertisement like you did." The man who placed it described himself as a successful businessman in Denver. When she arrived, she found he was actually the owner of a house of ill repute. He tried to force her to work for him. His hands clenched into fists. She escaped, made her way to a church. The minister there helped her contact me. By the time I arrived in Denver, she was desperately ill with pneumonia. She died 3 days later. "Oh, Frank," Cecilia placed her hand over his. "I'm so sorry." He turned his hand to clasp hers. "That's why I was concerned about your arrangement with Blackburn. I've seen how these things can go wrong." "And yet you're helping me get to him," Cecilia said. Frank's gaze was intense. "I'm helping you get to Sierra Vista. What happens after that?" He trailed off, then gently released her hand. "We should get some sleep. Long day tomorrow. But as Cecilia lay in her bedroll later, sleep remained elusive. She couldn't stop thinking about the feel of Frank's hand holding hers, or the unfinished thought that hung in the air between them. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they entered the Arizona territory. The wagon train had to navigate narrow passes and steep inclines, sometimes making only a few miles progress in a day. The June heat was relentless, and water sources grew scarcer. It was during one particularly difficult stretch as they searched for water that they encountered a small band of Apache. For a tense moment, the wagon train halted, the men reaching for their rifles. Frank rode forward with the wagon master, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. To Cecilia's surprise, he spoke to the Apache leader in what appeared to be their own language, halting and imperfect, but recognizable enough that the tension visibly eased. Later, he explained to the astonished wagon train members that the Apache had directed them to a hidden spring 2 miles west of their current position. "I worked with a half Apache cowboy for 3 years," he said. "Taught me some of the language enough to get by." That night, with fresh water to drink and cook with, the mood in the camp was celebratory. Someone produced a fiddle and impromptu dancing began around the fire. Martha Wilson, bouncing baby Eliza on her hip, nudged Cecilia. "Your cowboy's watching you again." Cecilia glanced across the fire to where Frank stood, and sure enough, his eyes were on her. When their gazes met, he didn't look away. "He's not my cowboy," Cecilia protested, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Martha snorted. "Tell that to someone who hasn't seen the way you two look at each other." She pressed Eliza into her husband's arms. "Now go dance with him before somebody else does." As if on cue, Frank approached, his hat in his hands. "Miss Osmond, would you do me the honor?" The fiddle player had started a slow waltz. Frank's hand at her waist was warm and steady as he guided her in a simple box step. Despite the uneven ground and the crackling fire for illumination, Cecilia had never danced more beautifully in her life. "3 more days to Sierra Vista," Frank said quietly. Cecilia's heart skipped. "So soon?" Second thoughts. His eyes searched hers. I don't know," she admitted. "Everything seemed so clear when I left Boston." Frank's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Cecilia, there's something I need to tell you about Howard Blackburn," but at that moment, the dance ended and they were surrounded by laughing couples and children begging for their turn. The moment was lost. The next morning, they departed early, eager to reach the next water source before the worst heat of the day. Cecilia tried repeatedly to speak privately with Frank, to hear what he'd been about to tell her, but between her duties teaching the children and his responsibilities as one of the scouts, they had no opportunity for uninterrupted conversation. That night, however, Frank sought her out as she was returning from helping Martha put her children to bed. "Walk with me," he asked, his expression serious. They moved away from the wagon circle, finding a relatively private spot beneath a twisted juniper tree. The moon was rising, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. "What were you going to tell me about Howard Blackburn?" Cecilia asked directly. Frank ran a hand through his hair. "I know him," he said, "or I know of him. His ranch is about 5 miles from the land I'm purchasing." Cecilia waited, sensing there was more. "He's not." Frank seemed to struggle with his words. "He's not what I'd consider a good man, Cecilia. He's had 2 wives before. The first died in childbirth. The second left him after less than a year. There are rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Cecilia's voice was barely audible. "That he's cruel, that he drinks too much, that he—" Frank's jaw tightened. "That he's rough with women." Cecilia felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "At first, I wasn't sure if it was the same Howard Blackburn. It's not an uncommon name. Then, after I realized it probably was, I didn't want to. I didn't want to influence your decision unfairly. I thought perhaps the rumors were exaggerated or that he'd changed." Frank's hands clenched at his sides. "But the closer we get to Sierra Vista, the more I can't bear the thought of delivering you to a man like that." Cecilia turned away, trying to absorb this new information. Everything she'd planned, everything she'd hoped for, suddenly seemed built on sand. "What am I to do?" she whispered. "I have no money of my own, no connections in Sierra Vista. I can't simply turn around and go back to Boston." Frank moved to stand before her, his expression resolute. "You have options, Cecilia. The Wilsons would take you and Martha's already offered. The town needs a schoolteacher. Or, she prompted when he fell silent, or you could marry me instead." The words hung in the night air between them. "Frank, I know it's sudden," he said quickly. "And I know I'm not what you expected when you set out from Boston. I don't have a grand ranch yet, just a promise of land and years of hard work ahead. But I swear to you, Cecilia Osmond, I would cherish you every day of my life. I would never raise a hand to you in anger. I would build you a home filled with books and laughter, and I would try every day to be worthy of you." Cecilia stared at him, her heart pounding. She thought of the weeks they'd traveled together, of his unfailing kindness, his quiet strength, the way her pulse quickened whenever he was near. "You barely know me," she said softly. Frank's smile was gentle. "I know enough. I know you're brave and kind. I know you light up when you're teaching those children. I know you hum to yourself when you think no one's listening, always the same tune, though I can't place it. I know you miss your books, but you love the open sky. I know the sound of your laugh makes me happier than I've been in years." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears. "And what of your plans? You've saved for 10 years for your ranch." "Plans change," he said simply. "Dreams change. I'd rather have you and start over than have everything else without you." Cecilia took a deep breath. In Boston, she'd been raised to be practical, to make sensible decisions. Marrying a man she'd known for less than a month, a man who was still essentially a stranger despite their shared journey, was neither practical nor sensible, and yet. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." Frank's face transformed with joy. He took a step toward her, then stopped. "May I?" He began, then cleared his throat. "May I kiss you, Cecilia?" In answer, she closed the distance between them, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. His arms came around her, strong and secure, and Cecilia felt as if she'd finally found her way home after a long journey. The next day, they shared their news with the wagon train. Martha Wilson squealed with delight, hugging Cecilia fiercely. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "James, didn't I say they were meant for each other?" Jasper Stone, the wagon master, offered to perform the ceremony once they reached Sierra Vista, explaining that, as a former justice of the peace, he still retained the authority to marry them. The final 2 days of the journey passed in a blur of anticipation and planning. Martha helped Cecilia wash and mend her best dress, while the other women in the wagon train contributed small tokens: a handkerchief embroidered with tiny flowers, a blue ribbon for her hair, a small silver pin shaped like a star. As they crested the final ridge and saw the settlement of Sierra Vista spread out below them in the valley, Cecilia felt a moment of doubt. What if Howard Blackburn recognized her? What if he challenged her decision? Frank, riding beside her, seemed to sense her anxiety. Having second thoughts, he asked quietly. Cecilia shook her head. "Just wondering what will happen when we reach town." "We'll be married," Frank said simply. "We'll buy our land, we'll build our home, and if Howard Blackburn has anything to say about it, he'll answer to me." Sierra Vista was larger than Cecilia had expected: a proper town with a main street lined with businesses, a church with a tall white steeple, and neighborhoods of houses spreading outward from the center. In the distance, she could see ranches dotting the surrounding hills. The wagon train made camp at the edge of town, and preparations for the wedding began immediately. Martha insisted Cecilia use the Wilson wagon to prepare, shooing away the men and children to give her privacy. "My first wedding gift to you," Martha said, handing Cecilia a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a nightgown of fine white cotton, simply made but prettier than anything Cecilia owned. Every bride deserves something special for her wedding night. Cecilia blushed, but thanked her new friend warmly. The ceremony took place at sunset, with the entire wagon train gathered in a semicircle. Jasper Stone stood waiting with Frank, who had somehow managed to obtain a new shirt for the occasion and had slicked back his wheat gold hair with water. As Cecilia approached, escorted by James Wilson, a hush fell over the gathering. Frank's eyes never left her face, his expression one of such naked adoration that Cecilia felt her heart might burst from happiness. The ceremony was brief but moving. Stone spoke of the hardships and joys of married life on the frontier, of the importance of partnership and trust. When it came time for the vows, Frank's voice was steady and sure. "I, Frank Evans, take you, Cecilia Osmond, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love, honor, and cherish you all the days of my life. I promise to build you a home filled with books and laughter. I promise to write you a new letter of promise every day if that's what it takes to show you how much you mean to me." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears as she repeated her own vows. When Stone pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed her with a tenderness that made the women sigh and the men cheer. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful, a communal meal, music from the fiddle player, dancing under the stars. As the night grew late, Frank led Cecilia away from the festivities toward a small tent he'd set up apart from the main camp. "I know it's not much of a bridal chamber," he said apologetically, "but I've arranged for us to stay at the boarding house in town starting tomorrow while I finalize the land purchase." Cecilia squeezed his hand. "It's perfect." Inside the tent, Frank had spread clean blankets over a bed of soft grasses. A small lantern provided warm, golden light. Beside the makeshift bed sat a package wrapped in brown paper, similar to the one Martha had given her. "A wedding gift," Frank explained, suddenly looking nervous. "It's not much." Cecilia unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a book, a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. Opening it, she found an inscription on the flyleaf in Frank's neat handwriting. "To Cecilia, my wife, my heart, my home. This is my letter of promise to you that every word of love contained herein is but a fraction of what I feel for you. Yours always, Frank." "Oh, Frank," tears filled her eyes again. "It's beautiful." He took her hands in his. "I meant what I said in my vows, Cecilia. I'll write you a new letter of promise every day if that's what it takes to show you how much I love you." "I don't need letters," she whispered, setting the book carefully aside and stepping into his embrace. "I just need you." The next morning, they rode into Sierra Vista together, husband and wife. Frank took her first to the land office, where he completed the purchase of his property, 160 acres of prime grazing land with a year-round creek running through it, 5 miles west of town. "There's a small cabin already built," he told her as they left the office, the deed safely tucked into his vest pocket. "Nothing fancy, but it's solid. We can add to it as we go along." As they walked down the main street toward the general store, where Frank wanted to purchase supplies for their new home, Cecilia suddenly froze. Coming out of the saloon across the street was a heavy-set man with a florid face and an expensive suit that nonetheless looked rumpled and stained. "That's him, isn't it?" she whispered. "Howard Blackburn." Frank's arm tightened around her waist. "Yes." As if sensing their scrutiny, Blackburn looked up. His gaze passed over them without recognition, then he staggered slightly and continued down the boardwalk in the opposite direction. "He doesn't recognize me," Cecilia said, relief washing over her. "Would you have wanted him to?" Frank asked. Cecilia shook her head firmly. "No, that part of my life is over." She smiled up at her husband. "I'm Mrs. Frank Evans now, and I couldn't be happier about it." The months that followed were filled with hard work and joy in equal measure. The cabin, as Frank had said, was small but solid, a single room with a stone fireplace, plank floors, and 2 windows that let in ample light. Together, they made it a home, adding curtains sewn from fabric purchased in town, shelves for Frank's small but growing collection of books, a braided rug before the hearth. Frank threw himself into improving the ranch. digging irrigation ditches to bring water from the creek to a vegetable garden Cecilia planted, building corrals for the small herd of cattle he purchased with the remainder of his savings. He also built in addition to the cabin a second room that would serve as their bedroom, giving them more space in the main room for living and eventually, they hoped, for children. Cecilia found her place in the community as well. When the town council learned of her teaching experience, they offered her a position at the small school. 3 days a week, she taught the children of Sierra Vista, returning to the ranch in the late afternoon to work alongside Frank. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, sometimes reading aloud to each other from one of their precious books, sometimes simply talking about their day or their plans for the future. And true to his word, Frank often presented Cecilia with small notes left in her lunch pail, tucked into her book, placed on her pillow, each one a letter of promise expressing his love and devotion. Their life wasn't without challenges. The first winter was harsh, with blizzards that isolated them in their cabin for days at a time. A mountain lion killed 2 of their calves in the spring. The creek nearly ran dry during a summer drought, threatening both their garden and their cattle. But through it all, they faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. And when, a year after their wedding, Cecilia discovered she was expecting their first child, their happiness seemed complete. "A baby," Frank said wonderingly, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Cecilia asked, watching his face. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he replied, gathering her close. "You've given me everything I ever wanted, Cecilia Evans, a home, a family, a purpose." He kissed her softly. "And to think if that ferry hadn't capsized and you hadn't lost your letter." "It was the best thing that ever happened to me," Cecilia said firmly. "Losing that letter led me to you." Their son, Samuel, was born on a crisp autumn morning, with Martha Wilson now their closest neighbor, as the Wilsons had purchased land adjoining the Evans Ranch serving as midwife. He had Frank's wheat gold hair and Cecilia's green eyes, and from his first breath, he was the center of his parents' world. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy young boy, the Evans Ranch prospered as well. Frank added more cattle to their herd each year, built a proper barn and a bunkhouse for the 2 hired hands they now employed. Cecilia continued teaching, bringing Samuel with her to the schoolhouse until he was old enough to help his father on the ranch. The cabin expanded again, another bedroom for Samuel, a proper kitchen for Cecilia, and most precious to her, a small library where they gathered on winter evenings, reading by lamplight while the wind howled outside. And still, almost every day, Frank would write Cecilia a note, sometimes just a line or two, sometimes a full page, each one a renewal of the promise he'd made that night beneath the stars. "I found your notes," Cecilia told him one evening, 5 years into their marriage. She showed him the wooden box where she'd kept every single one. "I've saved them all." Frank looked at the hundreds of folded papers with amazement. "That's a lot of promises." "And you've kept every one," she said, moving into his embrace. Who would have thought that losing a letter would lead to gaining so many? 4 years later, their family grew again with the birth of their daughter, Emma. By then, the Evans Ranch was one of the most successful in the territory, and Frank had become a respected member of the community, serving on the town council and helping to establish a cattlemen's association. Cecilia, now in her early 40s, had helped found a proper library for Sierra Vista, donating many books from their personal collection and organizing fundraising efforts to purchase more. The small library building, constructed next to the schoolhouse, bore a plaque dedicating it to the memory of Clara Evans, Frank's sister, whose tragic story had led him to help a stranded mail-order bride all those years ago. Howard Blackburn's name was seldom mentioned between them, though occasionally they would hear news of him. His ranch had failed, lost to gambling debts and poor management. He had left Sierra Vista some years earlier, reportedly heading for California. Neither Frank nor Cecilia wasted much thought on the man who might have altered the course of their lives. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank presented Cecilia with a special gift, a proper gold wedding band to replace the simple silver one he'd hastily purchased in Sierra Vista the day after their wedding. "I promised you I'd give you a better one someday," he reminded her as he slipped it onto her finger. "The first one was perfect," she protested, though her eyes shone with pleasure at the new ring's simple elegance. "Maybe so," Frank agreed, kissing her hand. "But you deserve the best of everything, Cecilia Evans." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch of their home, no longer a cabin but a proper ranch house with a wide veranda overlooking the valley. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, while in the distance, their cattle grazed contentedly on the lush grass beside the creek. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked suddenly. "Marrying a cowboy instead of the successful rancher you were promised?" Cecilia laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Frank Evans, you are the successful rancher I was promised, just not by Howard Blackburn." She took his hand in hers. "Everything I have, everything I am, is because you stopped for a bedraggled woman on a riverbank and offered to write her a better letter." Frank smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made." "Mine too," Cecilia said softly. "Mine too." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, hands clasped, surrounded by the life they'd built together, a life born from a lost letter and the promise of something better. And in the years that followed, as their children grew, as the ranch prospered, as Sierra Vista transformed from frontier settlement to thriving town, Frank and Cecilia Evans continued to write their story together, one day at a time, each moment a letter of promise fulfilled.